If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship. This is the second episode in our four-part series on female autism and therapy. Previously, we explored why an entire generation of women was missed by a diagnostic system that wasn't built to see them. We examined the female autism phenotype, the exhausting mechanics of masking, the double empathy problem, and the profound mental health consequences of decades of invisibility and invalidation. Today, we are stepping inside the therapy room because here's the thing: an autistic woman who finally seeks therapy, often after years of burnout, misdiagnosis, and the particular exhaustion of performing neurotypicality, deserves a therapeutic environment that does not ask her to keep performing. And yet, current research makes clear that traditional therapy models built on neurotypical social rules and assumptions frequently do exactly that. The very space designed to offer relief can inadvertently demand continued masking, amplifying the stress the client came to treat. This episode is about what it actually takes to build a therapeutic relationship that functions as a genuine, secure base for autistic women. We'll talk about the physical environment, the relational environment, communication, and the fundamental shift in clinical stance that neurodiversity-affirming care requires. This is grounded in current peer-reviewed research, qualitative lived experience data, and foundational frameworks including person-centered therapy, attachment theory, and relational care through a feminist lens. To understand what neurodiversity-affirming therapy looks like, we first have to be honest about what the traditional model has looked like and what the research says about its impact. The medical model frames autistic traits as pathological deficits, symptoms to be reduced, behaviors to be corrected, presentation to be normalized. Interventions like ABA and standard social skills training were built on this premise. Their underlying objective was to make the autistic individual appear and function as neurotypical as possible. And if an autistic woman is coming to therapy because the effort of performing neurotypicality is destroying her mental health, a therapy that trains her to perform it more efficiently is not treatment. It is an extension of the original harm. The data bears this out in stark terms. Research found that individuals exposed to standard ABA interventions were 86% more likely to meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. The mechanism matters. When a therapy systematically suppresses the regulatory behaviors a nervous system depends on, like stimming, routine, the ability to disengage, it does not teach the client to need those things less. It traps them in overwhelm without access to their own tools. The nervous system experiences that as a profound loss of agency, and that is the foundation of trauma. Neurodiversity affirming care begins with a categorically different premise. Autism is not a disease process. It is a natural, non-pathological neurological variation. You do not treat a neurotype. What you treat is the very real distress, the anxiety, the depression, the trauma that accumulates when a person spends decades existing in a world that was not built for their brain. The clinical objectives shift accordingly, from trait reduction to relational safety, from normative functioning to genuine well-being, from fixing the person to holding them in their full humanity. Current research proposes a clear organizing principle for this work: safety before insight. A regulated nervous system is the prerequisite for all therapeutic processing. Everything else follows from that. Before a single word of therapy is spoken, the physical environment has already sent the client's nervous system a message. The question is what that message is. Researchers describe what they call the waiting room trap, and it's worth picturing concretely. A typical clinic waiting room can involve phones ringing, harsh fluorescent lighting, unpredictable foot traffic, and the pressure of anticipation. For an autistic nervous system, that baseline sensory load can spike anxiety so significantly that by the time the client enters the therapy room, her cognitive resources are already depleted. Some participants in a qualitative study noted that they spent most of the therapy hour simply trying to physiologically recover from the waiting room or the drive or the transition to the therapy room. One woman's session had not yet begun and she was already in survival mode. This is one reason why sensory accommodation is not a polite gesture or an optional add-on. It's foundational clinical work. The sensory frame must be secured before any therapeutic processing can occur. Validating a client's sensory world is not simply being nice. It is a clinical necessity. The difference between a nervous system that can engage and one that is defending against threat. Practically, this means making deliberate environmental adjustments like soft, indirect lighting, consistent room layouts that reduce the cognitive load of navigating unfamiliar space, the removal of small but persistent sensory irritants like loudly ticking clocks. It means explicit invitations to use stimming tools or wear noise-reducing headphones or use a weighted blanket. And it means a serious reconsideration of the physical boundaries of therapy itself. Here's where neurodiversity-affirming care asks something more radical of clinicians, letting go of the assumption that therapy must occur in a specific room with two people seated directly opposite one another. The research explicitly encourages therapists to move beyond the four walls of the traditional clinic and be creative about where and how connection is built. For many autistic clients, the intense pressurized focus of a formal clinical room generates its own anxiety. Side-by-side seating, angled chairs, or the option to sit on the floor are not unconventional indulgences. They remove a significant source of cognitive load and communicate physically and immediately that this space operates by different rules. One study highlighted a therapist who began conducting sessions as walking appointments in an arboretum adjacent to her office. Moving side by side in a natural environment entirely bypassed the social pressure of the clinical setting, and meaningful therapeutic work became possible in a way that it had not been before. Beyond the physical layout, the structural boundaries of therapy must also be made explicit. And this is a point that research emphasizes strongly. Because social templates and scripts from everyday life do not automatically transfer to the therapy room, the therapist must literally explain the rules of engagement, what sessions will look like, what the boundaries of the relationship are, what is and is not part of the therapeutic container. For an autistic client, unstated expectations are not a neutral absence. They are a source of ongoing anticipatory anxiety. Clear agendas, a predetermined session format, and explicit explanations of what to expect provide the predictability that functions in attachment terms as a holding environment. They reduce the intolerance of uncertainty that generates baseline anxiety before any clinical content has even been introduced. Transition boundaries also require specific attention. The standard practice of ending a session and immediately expecting the client to transition back into the outside world may need modification. Sometimes the ability to sit quietly for 10 minutes after the session can be regulating for this transition. This simple structural adjustment honors the reality that transitions, particularly the shift from a state of genuine therapeutic engagement back into the sensory demands of the world outside, require their own processing time. The underlying principle across all of these accommodations is the same. Safety is not a feeling, it's a structure, and it must be built deliberately before any other clinical work begins. The sensory frame must be secured before any therapeutic processing can actually happen. Now let's talk about the relational environment, because once the physical space is secured, the space between therapist and client must meet the same standard. Traditional psychodynamic training introduced the concept of the therapist as a blank slate, a neutral, unreadable presence designed to function as a projection screen, encouraging the client to project their own internal patterns onto the therapist for analysis. In many contexts, that model has theoretical merit, but for an autistic client, someone who's spent her entire life being misunderstood, corrected, and rejected by neurotypical people, an ambiguous, unreadable therapist does not create a calming open space. It creates a threat. For many late diagnosed autistic women, a therapist who maintains strict professional distance is experienced not as a safe container, but as an authority figure existing behind a shell, a facade that is impossible to read and impossible to trust. The client's brain, shaped by a lifetime of social misreading and rejection, defaults to anticipating the worst. A neutral silence is read as boredom. A furrowed brow during thoughtful listening is interpreted as disapproval. A pause before responding registers as judgment. The client expends enormous cognitive energy trying to decode the therapist's microexpressions, energy that is no longer available for the actual work of therapy. In this context, ambiguity is not a tool for reflection. It is actively dysregulating to the autistic nervous system. The blank slate does not reduce the burden on the client, it increases it. It's also worth naming the feminist dimension of this dynamic. Strict professional distance is not a neutral clinical stance. From a feminist perspective, it reflects an application of power, the clinician as the withholding authority. For autistic women who have spent decades navigating systems that dismissed, pathologized, and talked over their own experience of themselves, a therapist who maintains a professional facade like that is not offering safety. They are replicating the very dynamic that caused harm in the first place. Current research points toward radical transparency as the necessary alternative. And to understand what this looks like in practice, it helps to think about it through the lens of Carl Rogers' 3 foundational conditions for a successful therapeutic alliance: congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. For autistic clients, each of these must be practiced in what the research describes as an enhanced or amplified form. So enhanced congruence means replacing the professional facade with something more genuinely human. Autistic women often possess heightened affective empathy and can viscerally sense inauthenticity. A scripted rapport building technique, an artificially modulated vocal tone, a performed warmth that doesn't quite reach the eyes, these perceived incongruences do not go unnoticed. They register as red flags. Radical congruence asks the therapist to show up as a real, vulnerable, and genuinely interested human presence. Predictable not because they are performing consistency, but because they are actually who they appear to be. This authenticity is built through therapeutic transparency. The clinician explicitly narrates their internal thoughts and feelings, actively translating ambiguous nonverbal cues into clear data. So a thoughtful frown becomes, "I want you to know that I'm frowning right now because I'm thinking carefully about what you just said, not because I am displeased." By naming what is happening internally, the therapist lifts the exhausting cognitive burden of the client having to read the room. Enhanced empathy moves beyond simple reflective listening toward what the research describes as tentative interpretation, phrasing insights as gentle guesses rather than clinical conclusions. "I might not have this right, but I'm wondering if..." This framing ensures the client remains the ultimate expert of her own lived experience, rather than being told what she feels by the person who is supposed to be helping her understand it. Empathy in this framework is a tender heart that does not assume understanding. It asks for it carefully and humbly. Enhanced unconditional positive regard moves beyond a silent internal stance to become something explicitly vocalized and practically demonstrated. Rather than assuming the client intuitively feels accepted, the therapist announces it. Not implied warmth, but stated warmth. A therapist practicing radical transparency might say, "I want to let you know that I'm smiling and leaning in right now because I care about your well-being and I'm genuinely engaged in what you're sharing. Does my body language convey that to you?" By defining their body language out loud, the therapist removes the burden of interpretation entirely. This level of explicitness can feel unfamiliar to clinicians trained in professional neutrality. But we have to weigh the purpose of that neutrality against the cost of ambiguity. Traditional therapeutic distance exists to keep the therapist's ego out of the room, not to create an environment that actively dysregulates the client. And judicious self-disclosure, sharing the contents of the therapist's mind, admitting uncertainty, explicitly validating the client's experience, does something that strict professional distance cannot. It restores power balance. It positions the client as the expert on her own life rather than the subject of clinical observation. From both a neurodiversity-affirming and a feminist standpoint, autistic clients frequently describe therapist self-disclosure not as a boundary violation, but as the very foundation of trust, the thing that finally makes the clinician a predictable, real human being rather than an authority to be managed. A therapist who has achieved this communicates something the client may never have heard from a clinical authority before. I'm not here to cure your neurotype. I'm here to understand how this environment is impacting you and to figure out how we can navigate this together. One qualitative study captured the essence of this beautifully. When autistic adult participants were asked what made a therapist feel safe, multiple people independently mentioned therapists who offered them a drink or a snack, something so seemingly small. But one participant explained that the gesture domesticated the setting. It stripped away the sterile clinical hierarchy and proved the therapist had a tender heart. They were not a doctor analyzing a specimen. They were a human being hosting another human being. Other clients indicated it was when the therapist told the client that she liked her and cared about her, gave her permission to send her a weekly check-in email, or advocated for her in a specific way. Enhanced unconditional positive regard is exactly that, a promise of safety demonstrated through the simple magic of dimmed lights, a weighted blanket offered, or a warm cup of tea that finally gives the weary soul permission to unmask. When a therapist achieves this, radical congruence, tentative empathy, and explicitly vocalized warmth, the therapeutic space transforms. It becomes what attachment theory calls a secure base and a protected harbor, a reliable foundation from which a client can safely explore difficult internal terrain, knowing she has a containing relationship to return to. Within this holding space, the therapist enables the client to reconnect with a sense of psychological safety and to experience deep emotions without the fear of being lost in them. This sense of security is not incidental to the work. It is the prerequisite for it. The exhausting process of unmasking, of dismantling decades of social camouflage built brick by brick in response to a world that penalized her authentic self, can only begin when the client feels unconditionally accepted within the relationship. Ultimately, the therapeutic relationship built on radical transparency and explicit warmth becomes a corrective experience, dismantling traditional clinical hierarchies in favor of a safe, authentic bond that may be unlike anything the client has encountered before. The therapy room stops being a testing ground for neurotypical performance. It becomes finally the place where the performance ends. Once relational safety and sensory safety is established, the deeper clinical work becomes possible. And that work requires one more fundamental shift. The therapist must step down from the position of sole authority. For decades, the foundational theories of autism were developed almost entirely by non-autistic observers. Autistic people were the subjects of the research, systematically excluded from contributing their own lived experience to the clinical frameworks that define them. The result is what researchers called epistemic injustice. The autistic client has been gaslit, in the most literal sense, by a system that told her its outsider observations were more valid than her insider experience. Neurodiversity-affirming care offers a direct corrective through what the research terms relational humility. The clinician's open acknowledgement that while they hold expertise in psychological frameworks, the client is the undisputed authority on her own internal world. The therapeutic relationship becomes a genuine collaboration, equal partners working together to understand how the environment is impacting this particular person and what would actually constitute a good outcome for her, not for a normative standard, but for her. This collaborative stance has immediate practical implications for how we use clinical tools. Evidence-based modalities were not designed with autistic neurology in mind, and when applied rigidly, they frequently break down. Not because the client is avoidant or resistant, because the neurological bridge does not function in the expected way. The client is experiencing an enormous internal storm. Neurodiversity-affirming adaptations of these modalities shift the focus accordingly. Approaches must be adapted. Rather than assigning homework that may trigger executive dysfunction paralysis, the therapist allows insights to be processed on the client's own timeline. Rather than treating an autistic shutdown, that state of nonverbal withdrawal when the nervous system is overwhelmed, as avoidance or coldness, the affirming therapist recognizes it as the physiological reality it is, a nervous system that has absorbed too much and needs a secure base to simply hold space without demand. Autistic shutdowns, as we noted in episode 1, are often the result of hyperempathy, a system that has taken in too much emotional data and tripped the breaker. The therapeutic response is not to push through. It's to reduce demands, to allow silence, and to trust that the secure base itself is doing meaningful work. All of the elements we have covered today, sensory safety, structural predictability, radical transparency, relational humility, adapted tools, are working toward one central clinical objective. They are building the conditions under which an autistic woman can finally, genuinely unmask. Unmasking is not a technique, it's a destination, and it can only be reached from a secure base. For many autistic women, the therapy room will be the first environment in their lives where they are explicitly told, you don't have to perform here, you don't have to manage my comfort, you don't have to translate yourself into a language I find easier to read. You can stim if you need to. You can be quiet if the words stop coming. You can tell me when something I have said lands wrong. You're not here to satisfy a clinical standard. You're here to be known. That permission, explicit, repeated, and demonstrated through consistent action, is not soft or supplementary. It's the mechanism through which the deep processing required for trauma recovery becomes possible. A client who must perform therapy and worry about the therapist cannot simultaneously examine herself. Part of this work also involves gently addressing what researchers called internalized ableism, the ways in which an autistic woman has absorbed the message over decades that her natural way of being is the problem. The therapist's role is to help her differentiate between her authentic needs and the neurotypical expectations she has spent a lifetime trying to meet. To reframe the narrative of her life from I'm a broken version of a neurotypical person to I am an authentically autistic woman navigating a world that was not designed for me. This includes recognizing and naming the genuine strengths of the autistic profile: pattern recognition, intellectual depth, intense loyalty, creativity, and a capacity for empathy that, as we talked about in episode 1, is not absent but often overwhelming in its intensity. A strengths-based lens is not toxic positivity. It is a clinical corrective to a lifetime of deficit framing. And sometimes neurodiversity-affirming care extends beyond the therapy room entirely, helping a client navigate an accommodation request, supporting her through a job application, or assisting her in understanding her legal rights. These are not departures from the clinical work. In a genuinely affirming framework, practical advocacy is an expression of unconditional positive regard. It demonstrates in action that the therapist sees her whole life as worthy of care, not just the parts that fit neatly into an outdated framework. Let's bring today's threads together. We began with the recognition that traditional therapy, built on neurotypical social roles, can inadvertently demand that autistic women continue masking, amplifying the very distress they came to address. We walk through the sensory and structural foundations of a genuinely safe environment: soft lighting, consistent routines, thinking outside the box. explicit invitations for regulatory behaviors, and the elimination of sensory barriers before any therapeutic processing begins. We examined radical transparency, the practice of removing ambiguity from the relational space through explicit warmth, narrated intentions, and the willingness to be a legible human being rather than a professional projection screen. We talked about adapting clinical tools to respect the realities of alexithymia and autistic shutdowns. And we arrived at the core ethical and clinical commitment of this work, treating the autistic woman as the undisputed expert on her own life and building the kind of collaborative partnership in which unmasking becomes not just possible, but safe. I want to leave you with the closing question embedded in the research itself. If explicit warmth, radical transparency, sensory attunement, and genuine collaborative partnership are what it takes to create deep psychological safety for autistic adults, wouldn't making those practices the standard in all therapy radically transform the way everyone heals? This research calls this an invitation to reconsider what we have been calling good enough therapy and what becomes possible when we reach for something more. In episodes 3 and 4, we'll go deeper into the specific treatment approaches that work for autistic women and into the layered complexity of misdiagnosis, co-occurring trauma, and the challenges that so often accompany this population, including what it means to do this work with integrity, humility, and genuine care. This has been If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship. Thank you for joining me.